Cromwell Castle had always cast a shadow on the village which stood below. Tonight, in the full moon, its shadow appeared exceptionally dark. The castle stood across the river atop a hill overlooking the small hamlet of Veilstone, and for the villagers who called this place their home, it was a bad omen. Inspector Beckett had come to town whilst investigating a string of disappearances, all taking place within Veilstone. He had approached numerous townsfolk who had been helpful enough, but when the conversation turned toward Cromwell Castle, the villagers became spacious and evasive. For whatever reason, the castle was always met with hushed tones and non-answers. Inspector Beckett found it rather odd. Before heading to Veilstone, Inspector Beckett brushed up on the disappearances, so as to be fully versed in the cases by the time he arrived by carriage. There were 3 disappearances in total. The first happened just a month ago when a young boy delivering milk in the early morning hours never returned home. Timothy Godwell, age 11, missing. Last seen on Humboldt Street delivering milk. Contact the proper authorities if you have information, read the headline that week. The second and third to disappear were both widows, who had the misfortune of being out late at night. The cobblestone streets of Veilstone were frequented by the locals, but at night they became deserted. If they were deserted before the disappearances, they were altogether barren now. Inspector Beckett had obtained his job years ago and had solved cases of all sorts up and down the countryside. Murder, kidnapping, fraud, and even theft were his specialty. But what really piqued his interest were disappearances. Missing persons, more or less, were always the toughest cases. Once he had tracked down a missing girl, only to find that she never wanted to be found in the first place. Her parents were relieved to learn that she was alive, but she was less than thankful to be brought back home. Beckett had a feeling, though, that this case was not at all like the runaway girl. Inspector Beckett had never seen a double disappearance, let alone triple, all within the same vicinity, all within a few weeks of one another. He found himself perplexed by the ordeal. Could there be a killer on the loose? If so, where were the bodies? Had they all thrown themselves into the river? It seemed rather unlikely that young Mr. Godwell would. He may have fallen in, but then he would have washed ashore eventually. Inspector Beckett, deep in contemplation, now found himself on Cromwell Bridge, which connected Veilstone to Cromwell Castle across the river. He peered into the dark water below and tried to make sense of what he knew about the cases. He was looking for a connection but couldn't quite put the pieces together. Just then, Inspector Beckett heard a cough from behind him on the bridge. He turned to find an older-looking gentleman. He was short and hunched over, had white hair, and was frail. If it hadn't been for the cane, he would have fallen over. His eyes were red and his face damp. He had been crying. "Are you all right there, sir?" inquired Inspector Beckett. "Have you ever lost anyone close to you?" said the man. "Afraid I have." "Well, then you know what it's like. My grandson, Timothy was his name, died about 3 weeks ago." Inspector Beckett looked puzzled. "How do you know he is dead?" asked Beckett. "Well, I guess I don't. But he went missing, you see, and it's unlikely I'll ever see him again." The man started to cry again at the utterance of these words. Inspector Beckett quickly asked a follow-up question so as to get some answers before the man went fully incoherent. "Did your grandson have any spots in town that he liked to frequent?" "Well, yes, you're standing on it," the man said, pointing to the bridge. Beckett, now intrigued, asked the man what he knew about Cromwell Castle. He had half expected the man to act like the rest of the villagers and brush the question off, but he was pleasantly surprised to find that the old man acted in quite the opposite fashion. "All I know is that it's owned by a Sir Ivan Volkov. He's owned it as long as I can remember. Keeps it boarded up most of the time. I haven't seen him in many years, and when he is in town, he rarely comes out, save for at night. I hear he's in Romania most of the time, but that could be rumor. Must be a pretty old fellow now," said the man through his tears. "Thank you for the help," said Inspector Beckett. "I may just make a visit." "I would say don't bother," said the man, "but you may be in luck. I saw a light in one of the windows a few weeks back. I brushed it off as an old man's imagination, but maybe he's come back to visit." With that, the man turned to leave and disappeared down the bridge in the direction of Veilstone. Beckett turned the opposite way and made his way down the bridge toward Cromwell Castle. Each step closer to the castle sent waves of dread through his body. He didn't know why he was frightened, only that he was. When he reached the massive wooden doors, Beckett gave them a hesitant knock. To his astonishment, the doors groaned open slowly, revealing a dimly lit entrance. Stepping inside, Beckett felt a rush of cold air and an inexplicable sense of foreboding. At the far end of the entryway, a tall, elderly man with sharp, domineering eyes awaited him. This man was none other than Sir Ivan Volkov, the owner of Cromwell Castle. Ivan got the first word. "Good evening. It's not every day that I get a guest," he said. "You are just in time for dinner, and whatever you are here for can wait until we've shared in good food. I am often famished these days. Come, follow me to the Great Hall." Beckett, despite his reservations, agreed, eager to learn more about the mysterious disappearances in Veilstone. The man on the bridge was right. Ivan appeared old, though not nearly as old as one would expect given the castle's age. Inspector Beckett followed Ivan to the Great Hall and took a seat opposite him. Ivan poured himself a drink, but strangely didn't offer any to Inspector Beckett. Ivan then took a sip from his chalice and shuddered with relief. "It's good wine, you know," he said. Beckett had never seen wine like this before. It was deep red in color and seemed too thick to be any wine, but he convinced himself that it was unimportant and began to ask questions regarding the disappearances. Beckett began to explain the cases to Ivan, figuring that he hadn't heard their details, but Ivan seemed well versed. For a man who never left the castle, he was strangely knowledgeable. It was at this point that Beckett excused himself from the table. "The bathroom is down the hall to the left, the wine cellar is on the right, but we wouldn't want you going down there. It's very musty. I have been away for too long and haven't had the chance to have it cleaned yet," said Ivan. "I'll be sure to not get lost," replied Inspector Beckett with a polite nod. As Beckett wandered through the dimly lit corridor, he couldn't help but notice the portraits of previous owners of the castle, all bearing a striking resemblance to Ivan. Below each portrait was an inscription left to commemorate the date. The first portrait was almost 300 years old. It was almost as if an idea started to form in Inspector Beckett's mind. It was a terrible, awful, frightful idea. To be sure, he had to check the wine, but he couldn't exactly check the chalice in Ivan's right hand without drawing suspicion. As he made his way to the end of the corridor, he couldn't help but look at the door to the wine cellar. It was wrong to snoop without convincing evidence, but his curiosity got the best of him. He slowly opened the door and stepped inside. Inspector Beckett was immediately overtaken by a putrid smell, a smell that seemed to line the inside of his nose. It had stopped Beckett in his tracks, forcing him to gag in disgust. But the awful idea that had formed in his head was only growing more real, and he had to figure out if he was right. He forced his way down the cellar stairs, through the noxious fumes which suffocated his breath, and finally made it to the bottom step when he saw them. Bodies. 3 bodies were stacked on top of one another, pale and decaying. At the top of the stack was the body of a young boy. He couldn't tell because of the state of the bodies, but he was sure it was the body of young Timothy Godwell. What's worse were the walls of the cellar. Adorned along the length of the walls were clear serving pitchers, ready for the taking. Each was filled with the same red liquid that Ivan had been drinking in the Great Hall. From the pale, lifeless state of the bodies, he could deduce that the liquid in the pitchers was not wine, but blood. A terrified expression came over Inspector Beckett's face, and he felt ill. The smell now disappeared from Beckett's mind, and all he could see were the bodies. Beckett raced to the top of the cellar stairs and out of the cellar as fast as he could. He rushed down the corridor and found himself standing at the entrance to the Great Hall. There at the head of the table was a younger man, dark hair and tall. "Thank God. Before Ivan returns, we must get the town constable. He has killed 3 people, and I believe he's drinking their blood," Inspector Beckett said in panic. "Oh, he is," said the man at the head of the table. "And let me tell you, it suits him very well." Beckett at first was confused and then understood. In the dim light he hadn't noticed. The man at the head of the table looked like those in the paintings on the corridor walls. His eyes were sharp and domineering. You're Ivan, but how?" said Beckett, trembling. A smile crept along Ivan's face as he spoke. "A curse from a long time ago, a very long time ago." Ivan's face was almost too eager to see Beckett. He looked like a dog ready for a meal, almost salivating. "I'm sorry to say, Inspector, but I can't let you leave. I'm sure you understand." Inspector Beckett understood too well. In terror, he headed for the main entrance and to the door to escape the darkness of the castle, but he tripped over a chair in his terror, which broke under his weight. Ivan took the opportunity to swoop in and attack. His violence overtook Beckett, who attempted to shield the attack with his arm. Ivan bit down on Beckett's arm, sinking his teeth into his flesh. Ivan's expression turned to one of bliss as he tasted the warm blood pour out of Beckett's arm. Beckett screamed in terror and fumbled for something to fend off his attacker, but all he could find was a broken chair leg. He picked it up and plunged it into Ivan's chest as fast as he could, and the attack ended. Ivan let out a groan of agony as his face turned dark and cold. All of the life that had been in him was suddenly lost. What youth he seemed to have garnered was all but gone. His hair turned white and his skin became sunken, showing a skeletal existence of a man. He slowly ceased to breathe and eventually came to lay motionless on the castle floor. Beckett gathered what strength he had left and slowly walked from the halls of Cromwell Castle to Cromwell Bridge. He made his way to the side of the bridge and peered down at the water again, which now seemed to sparkle in the moonlight. Whatever shadow once loomed over Vileston now gave way. The evil that once held the town hostage was now gone, and Beckett had solved his case. Still, something was off. He looked down at his bleeding arm and saw 2 puncture holes where Ivan had sunk his teeth. He expected to feel pain, but was surprised to find that he only felt one thing: hungry.